Summer, 1944. Southern England. The warning came as a sound before it came as an explosion. A harsh, mechanical buzzing rolling in from the east. German V-1 flying bombs, Hitler's vengeance weapons, crossed the English Channel at roughly 400 miles per hour, aimed at London. They were pilotless, relentless, unimpressed by courage or intent. British anti-aircraft batteries answered with everything they had. Thousands of rounds fired each day. The sky filled with black bursts and falling shell fragments. And still the weapons came on. The problem was not bravery or training. It was mathematics. A V-1 moved faster than the human eye could track, with precision. By the time range, speed, and angle were calculated, by the time guns slewed and shells were fired, the missile was already somewhere else. Even near misses meant nothing. A shell could pass within 20 feet of a V-1 and do no damage at all. Traditional anti-aircraft shells detonated only on direct impact. Miss by inches, and you might as well have missed by miles. London's gunners did not need better aim. They needed shells that did not require a hit. They needed shells that could explode near the target. They needed artillery rounds that could sense proximity and decide, on their own, when to detonate. They needed something that sounded like magic. In July 1944, British batteries defending London received new American-made ammunition. No technical briefings, no explanations, just orders. Replace the old shells with these. Gunners loaded the unfamiliar rounds and waited. When the next wave of V-1s appeared, they opened fire. What happened defied experience. Shells that passed within 70 feet of the flying bombs detonated automatically. No impact, no preset timing. The blast waves tore through the V-1's thin aluminum skins. Engines failed. Airframes broke apart. Missiles cartwheeled into fields and sea instead of neighborhoods. Within less than 2 weeks, interception rates surged, from roughly 1 in 4 to nearly 4 out of 5. The sky over southern England had changed. German intelligence noticed immediately. Reports spoke of a sudden collapse in V-1 effectiveness. Captured documents show confusion, urgency, and disbelief. German analysts interrogated British gunners. They examined unexploded shells. They studied firing data and damage patterns. Nothing fit. There were no clockwork timers, no barometric triggers, no photoelectric sensors, only a small sealed tube inside the fuse. Something electrical. Something resembling a crude radio component. Why would an artillery shell need a radio? They never found the answer. The device that shattered 3/4 of the V-1 offensive, transformed naval anti-aircraft defense, and quietly reshaped modern warfare was called the VT fuse. Officially, variable time. Unofficially, the proximity fuse. It was a miniature radar system, small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, strong enough to survive launch forces exceeding 20,000 times gravity, precise enough to detonate at the exact lethal distance, and simple enough to be manufactured by the millions. Germany had radar, it had artillery, it had some of the finest physicists and engineers in the world, yet it never built this weapon. This is the story of how American and British scientists created a technology so advanced that their enemies could not understand it, even while holding its fragments in their hands. A weapon so secret that its true nature remained classified until the war was over. A weapon that killed not through greater explosive power, but through perfect timing. And it began with one question no one else thought to ask. What if shells could know when to explode? Metal aircraft bodies reflected radio waves. When planes passed near transmitters, signal strength wavered. Engineers in the 1920s and 1930s noticed the effect, and treated it as interference, a flaw to be filtered out, corrected, ignored. Radio was supposed to be clean, predictable. Any distortion was a problem to be solved away. One physicist did not ignore it. Merle Tuve worked at the Carnegie Institution of Washington, studying how radio waves moved through space. Throughout the 1930s, he experimented with bouncing signals off the ionosphere and measuring how long they took to return. It was a method for probing the upper atmosphere, but it rested on a simple idea. Radio waves could be sent out, reflected, and detected again. The principle behind radar, though the word was not yet in common use. In 1940, with Europe at war and American entry increasingly likely, Tuve attended a meeting of the National Defense Research Committee. The subject was anti-aircraft fire. The numbers were stark. Standard shells used impact fuses. They detonated only when they struck something solid. Against aircraft, that meant near misses were meaningless. Direct hits were rare. Combat data from the Spanish Civil War and the opening years of World War II showed hit rates hovering around 1 to 2%. Thousands of rounds expended for a single aircraft destroyed. Military officers described solutions they already understood. Better fire control computers, better optical sights, better training. Everything aimed at one goal, making gunners more accurate. Tuve listened, and then he asked a question that did not fit the discussion. Why did the shell need to hit the aircraft at all? If near misses were the norm, why not make near misses lethal? Timing fuses already existed, shells preset to explode at certain altitudes. They worked for barrage fire, filling the sky with explosions that aircraft flew through. But they depended on knowing altitude precisely, something combat conditions rarely allowed. Too high or too low, and the shell was wasted. Tuve proposed something else entirely. What if the shell carried its own radio transmitter and receiver? What if it sent out a signal as it flew and listened for the echo? When reflected waves from a nearby aircraft grew strong enough, when the shell was close enough, the fuse would detonate automatically. A radar set inside an artillery shell. The idea sounded unreasonable, then impossible. First, the electronics would have to survive firing. Artillery shells experienced accelerations exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity for milliseconds at launch. Vacuum tubes, the backbone of all modern electronics in 1940, were fragile glass devices. They broke if mishandled. Surviving a cannon shot bordered on fantasy. Second, the system had to fit. A standard 5-inch anti-aircraft shell offered a fuse cavity only a few inches tall and wide. Into that space had to go a transmitter, receiver, antenna, power source, safety systems, and detonator. Third, it had to be cheap. Anti-aircraft guns fired thousands of rounds per engagement. A fuse that cost as much as a car would never be used in sufficient numbers to matter. Fourth, it had to work almost every time. Failure rates acceptable in laboratories were unacceptable in combat. These devices had to function in rain, cold, heat, vibration, and shock. Reliably, repeatedly, without adjustment. Every electronics expert Tuve consulted said the same thing. It could not be done. Tuve assembled a team anyway. The program began officially in 1940 under Section T of the National Defense Research Committee. The letter was not symbolic. T stood for Tuve. The priority was absolute. Funding was effectively unlimited. The problem was so extreme that success seemed unlikely, but the cost of not trying was worse. If it worked, anti-aircraft warfare would change overnight. If it failed, nothing was lost but time. Tuve gathered a small, highly focused team. physicists and engineers who were comfortable operating at the edge of what electronics could survive. Among them were Lawrence Hafstad, Richard Roberts, Alexander Ellet, and dozens of others whose names rarely appear in popular histories. They were given a purpose-built home at the Applied Physics Laboratory, newly established at Johns Hopkins University specifically to solve this problem. The first obstacle was brutal and immediate: vacuum tubes. Every electronic system in 1940 depended on them, and every engineer knew they were fragile. Glass envelopes, fine internal filaments, components designed for laboratory benches and radio cabinets, not artillery. Firing one from a gun was, as one researcher put it, like launching a wine glass out of a cannon. Failure was not just likely, it was guaranteed. The team tried everything they could think of: smaller tubes, thicker glass, new filament materials, rubber mounts, springs, shock absorbers, damping compounds. Prototype fuses were loaded into shells and fired downrange. After each test, technicians recovered the rounds and opened them up. Month after month, the results were the same: shattered glass, broken filaments, total failure. The breakthrough came only when the team stopped trying to protect delicate components and accepted a harder truth. The entire design philosophy was wrong. Traditional vacuum tubes were built to be light and efficient. That made them vulnerable. For artillery, efficiency did not matter. Survival did. So they reversed every assumption. They built tubes with thick, short filaments, reinforced glass, rigid internal supports. Nothing delicate, nothing elegant. The result was crude by engineering standards. The tubes consumed more power, amplified less cleanly, generated noise, and violated nearly every rule of good radio design. But they did not break. By late 1941, the team had vacuum tubes that could survive accelerations exceeding 20,000 times gravity. They were ugly, they were inefficient, and they worked. That solved only the first problem. The second was size. Radar systems in 1941 filled rooms. Separate transmitters, separate receivers, large antennas, complex signal processing equipment. All of it had to be compressed into a space smaller than a coffee cup. The solution began with frequency. Lower frequencies demanded large antennas, so the team moved higher, settling around 200 megahertz. That choice alone shrank antenna requirements from feet to inches. Then they eliminated parts altogether. The shell's own metal nose became part of the antenna. There were no external protrusions, no fragile elements. The transmitter and receiver shared components, switching back and forth thousands of times per second instead of existing as separate circuits. Power posed another problem. A battery inside a live shell was a hazard, so the fuse remained electrically dead until firing. The immense acceleration of launch closed a mechanical switch, activating the battery only after the shell was safely on its way downrange. By solving problems through subtraction rather than addition, the team forced an entire radar system into the smallest possible volume. The shell was no longer just a projectile. It was becoming a machine that could sense the space around it while flying through it. The acceleration of firing solved one problem and created another. When the shell left the gun, the same force that threatened to destroy the electronics now served a purpose. It closed a mechanical switch, connecting the battery and bringing the fuse to life only after launch. Until that instant, the shell was inert, safe to handle, safe to store. By mid-1942, the team had working prototypes small enough to fit inside standard artillery fuses. They were astonishingly expensive. Each unit cost around $700, roughly $12,000 in modern terms. That price made them scientific marvels, not military solutions. A weapon fired by the thousands could not cost that much and still matter. The next problem was reliability. Early models failed between 30 and 40% of the time. Vacuum tubes burned out. Batteries died early. Radio circuits drifted out of tolerance. Detonators jammed. In a laboratory, those numbers might be acceptable. In combat, they were disastrous. So the team imposed discipline. Every component was tested before assembly. Every assembled fuse was tested again. Units were shaken, frozen, heated, soaked, and vibrated. They were subjected to shocks that replicated gunfire without ever leaving the factory. Anything that failed was dissected and redesigned. Manufacturers were brought in early, not after success, but during development. Engineers from companies like Raytheon, Sylvania, and Westinghouse worked alongside scientists from the Applied Physics Laboratory. The goal was not perfection. It was repeatability, a fuse that could be built by the million and work almost every time. By late 1942, reliability climbed toward 90%. Costs fell to roughly $18 per fuse. Still expensive, now affordable. One final obstacle remained: secrecy. The proximity fuse represented a technological advantage so large that exposure could nullify it overnight. If Germany or Japan understood the principle, countermeasures, or copies, might follow. The program was compartmentalized to the extreme. The fuse carried multiple cover names. Officially, VT stood for variable time. Unofficially, it meant vacuum tube, or nothing at all. Factory workers often did not know what they were building. Components were manufactured in separate locations and assembled elsewhere. Even within the military, usage was tightly restricted. The fuses could not be fired over land where unexploded rounds might be recovered. Early deployment was limited to naval anti-aircraft fire, where failures disappeared into the sea. The first combat test came in January 1943 at the Battle of Rennell Island. American cruisers came under attack by Japanese aircraft. For the first time, they fired proximity-fused 5-inch shells in combat. The effect was immediate and unsettling. Approaching aircraft flew into sudden bursts of explosions. Shells that passed tens of feet away detonated automatically, filling the air with fragments. Japanese pilots tried to evade, as they always had. It did not work. American anti-aircraft effectiveness jumped from roughly 1%, one aircraft destroyed per 100 rounds fired, to more than 10%. In some engagements, it climbed higher still. The difference was visible even to those under fire. Japanese commanders noticed. Intelligence reports described a sharp and unexplained increase in American defensive fire. Pilots spoke of shells that seemed to know when aircraft were nearby. Damaged planes returned to base with fragment patterns that made no sense. Investigators found no timing devices, no light sensors, no external triggers, only broken metal and unanswered questions. The secret held. By mid-1944, the secret was holding. Proximity fuse production had passed 1 million units per month. The devices were reliable, they were affordable, and most critically, they were still not understood by the enemy. No countermeasures, no copies, no effective response. Then Germany unleashed the V-1. The flying bomb was a simple weapon with a strategic purpose, a pilotless missile powered by a pulse jet engine, launched from ramps in occupied France and the Netherlands, flying at roughly 400 miles per hour toward London. Each carried a warhead of more than a ton of high explosive. The offensive began on June 13, 1944, 1 week after D-Day. Over the following months, more than 10,000 V-1s were launched at London and southern England. British defenses struggled immediately. Fighter aircraft could intercept some, but the V-1's speed and steady flight made interception difficult and dangerous. Anti-aircraft guns engaged in large numbers, but impact-fused shells were poorly suited to the task. The missile was small. It moved fast. Direct hits were rare. Near misses meant nothing. In July 1944, the ammunition changed. British anti-aircraft batteries received American-made proximity-fused shells for their standard 3.7-inch guns. There were no technical briefings, no explanations, only instructions. Replace the old ammunition with this. Fire as usual. The shells would do the rest. The first day told the story. 17 V-1s destroyed out of 91 launched. 19%. Already an improvement. Within 2 weeks, as gun crews adjusted to the new behavior of their weapons, interception rates climbed beyond 75%. 3 out of every 4 flying bombs were being destroyed before reaching the city. The effect on London was immediate. The steady toll of hundreds of civilian deaths per week collapsed into sporadic, isolated impacts. The sound that had defined fear, the engine cutting out, the pause, the explosion, became rare. People who had fled the capital began to return. The V-1 campaign lost its psychological power as quickly as it lost its aircraft. German intelligence was stunned. Reports from late 1944 show urgency and confusion. One assessment stated that British anti-aircraft effectiveness had increased inexplicably. Previously, interception required multiple direct hits. Now shells appeared to detonate near V-1s without impact. The mechanism was unknown. German engineers examined damaged V-1s that had crash-landed mostly intact. The fragment patterns told a clear story. Explosions nearby, not collisions. They recovered unexploded British shells and dismantled them. Inside the fuse, they found a sealed tube, an electrical component, a vacuum tube radio assembly. They could not place it. Some theorized photoelectric sensors triggered by the V-1's exhaust flame. Others suggested acoustic detection of the pulse jet's distinctive sound. A few considered radio-based proximity detection and rejected it outright. Miniature radar inside an artillery shell was not just difficult. It was, in their judgment, impossible. The correct explanation was literally in their hands. They could not see it. By September 1944, the V-1 offensive was effectively over. Allied ground forces overran launch sites in France. The few missiles still launched were intercepted at rates so high that the weapons ceased to matter. Hitler's vengeance weapon had been neutralized, not by a new aircraft or a larger gun, but by a fuse that knew when it was close enough. The proximity fuse had done exactly what it was designed to do. The V-1 campaign was only one battlefield where the fuse revealed its power. Elsewhere, the change was just as decisive, often more so, and far less visible to those trying to explain it afterward. At sea, proximity fuses rewrote the mathematics of survival. Before their introduction, American and British warships faced a grim equation. Shooting down a single attacking aircraft could require thousands of rounds. Against massed attacks, especially late in the war, defensive fire simply could not scale fast enough. Japanese kamikaze tactics in 1944 and 1945 exploited that weakness. Ships were not overwhelmed by precision, but by numbers. The proximity fuse changed that balance immediately. A shell no longer needed to strike an aircraft to matter. Passing close was enough. Every near miss became dangerous. Fire that once discouraged pilots now destroyed them. The effect was unmistakable during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. American ships equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition achieved kill rates 3 to 4 times higher than vessels using traditional shells. Attacking aircraft flew into dense fields of airbursts. Casualties mounted so quickly that some Japanese units reported missions becoming effectively suicidal. Nowhere was the impact clearer than at Battle of Okinawa. Facing sustained kamikaze attacks, American ships fired more than 1.2 million proximity-fused shells during the campaign. Hits still occurred. No defensive system could stop everything, but the damage was dramatically reduced. Ships survived attacks that would previously have crippled or sunk them. On land, the fuse changed artillery itself. Traditional impact-fused shells detonated on contact with the ground. Against troops in trenches or foxholes, much of the blast energy was absorbed by Earth. Proximity fuses detonated shells above the surface, often 20 to 30 feet in the air, producing airbursts that drove fragments downward in lethal cones. Cover that once worked no longer mattered. The first large-scale use of proximity-fused artillery came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German forces advancing through the Ardennes initially achieved surprise and momentum. They ran into American artillery units firing proximity-fused 105mm and 155mm shells. The effect was devastating. Infantry could not hide. Trees offered no protection. Buildings became traps. German troops trained to survive artillery fire discovered that this artillery behaved differently. Shells exploded overhead without striking anything. The ground no longer shielded them. One captured German officer summarized the experience bluntly during interrogation. "Your artillery has become incredibly deadly. Shells explode overhead without hitting anything. My men cannot take cover. It is as if you have some device that makes shells explode at the worst possible moment." He was right. Post-war analysis estimated that proximity-fused artillery was 5 to 10 times more effective against personnel than traditional shells. A bombardment that once required 100 rounds could now achieve the same effect with a fraction of that number. The implications went beyond lethality. Fewer shells meant fewer supply convoys, fewer transport losses, and fewer logistical failures. Efficiency became a weapon, and still the secret held. German and Japanese forces captured proximity-fused ammunition. They examined fragments. They understood that something new was happening. They never replicated it. The technology remained an Allied monopoly until the war's end. What had begun as a question about radio interference had become a force multiplier across every domain of warfare. Not louder, not larger, just timed perfectly. Post-war analysis put numbers to what soldiers already knew. Against personnel targets, proximity-fused artillery was estimated to be 5 to 10 times more effective than traditional impact-fused shells. A bombardment that once required 100 rounds could now achieve the same effect with 10 or 20. The battlefield consequences were obvious. The logistical consequences were just as important. Artillery effectiveness was never only about killing. It was about ammunition consumption, transport capacity. Supply lines stretched across oceans and continents. Every shell not fired was a truck not driven, a ship not loaded, a convoy not exposed. Proximity fuses allowed armies to do more with less, easing one of the heaviest burdens of modern war. Germany never fielded an equivalent technology. That failure was not the result of ignorance. Post-war interrogations of German scientists and engineers revealed a more uncomfortable truth. Germany had world-class physicists, a sophisticated electronics industry, advanced radar systems. In theory, all the necessary pieces were available. They were simply never assembled in the right way. German military research prioritized different problems: rocket weapons, the V-1 and V-2 jet aircraft, advanced tanks, strategic systems that promised decisive breakthroughs. Artillery fuses were not seen as a worthy focus. Incremental improvement did not match the vision of technological elegance German planners valued. There was also culture. Engineers who examined proximity fuse components often dismissed them as crude, inefficient, noisy. From a laboratory perspective, they were correct. The circuits violated principles of good electronic design. The tubes were heavy and inelegant. To German eyes, such devices did not look like the future of warfare. But they worked. By 1943 and 1944, Germany also faced hard limits. Industry struggled to replace basic losses. Ammunition shortages were constant. Fuel was scarce. Diverting resources to develop and mass-produce a complex new fuse, one whose value was not immediately obvious, was beyond reach. German air defenses relied on volume of fire and sophisticated centralized control. They achieved acceptable results by different means. The specific problem the proximity fuse solved was not perceived as urgent. Japan faced even steeper obstacles. Its electronics industry lagged behind Germany's. Research priorities centered on aircraft, ships, and torpedoes. The industrial base required to miniaturize and mass-produce radio-based fuses did not exist. Like Germany, Japan captured proximity-fused ammunition. Like Germany, Japanese engineers recognized that some form of radio mechanism was involved. Neither country successfully reverse-engineered it before the war ended. Throughout World War II, the proximity fuse remained an Allied monopoly. That secrecy extended even to those using it. Many Allied personnel fired the ammunition without knowing how it worked. The full story of its development and impact was not released until after victory, when technical details were finally published in 1945 and 1946. When the scientific community saw the details, the reaction was shock. A complete radar system reduced to the size of an artillery fuse, built to survive gun launch, reliable in combat, cheap enough to manufacture by the millions. It was an engineering achievement on par with any wartime breakthrough. The achievement did not go unnoticed, at least not in the long view. Military historians would later rank the proximity fuse among the most important technologies of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. It lacked a spectacle. There was no single moment of revelation, no blinding flash, yet its influence reached far more battles and far more days of fighting. American and British forces fired more than 22 million proximity-fused rounds during the war. Conservative estimates credit the fuse with preventing tens of thousands of Allied casualties by improving defenses against aircraft, V-1 weapons, and artillery bombardment. It saved lives, not by overwhelming force, but by making every shot count. Its impact did not end in 1945. After the war, proximity fuses became standard across military arsenals worldwide. Vacuum tubes were replaced by solid-state electronics. Ranges increased. Sensitivity improved. Costs dropped dramatically. But the principle remained unchanged. A munition that senses proximity and decides for itself when to detonate. Surface-to-air missiles, naval guns, anti-aircraft systems. Even some small arms ammunition now rely on the idea first proven in those early fuses. What Merle Tuve and his team developed between 1940 and 1942 became foundational to modern weapons design. The secrecy that protected the proximity fuse during the war also hid its story afterward. Because the technology remained classified until after victory, its role in specific battles was absent from early histories. Anti-aircraft success was attributed to better training, improved tactics, superior fire control. The fuse itself went unmentioned. Only decades later, as documents were declassified and veterans spoke more freely, did the picture sharpen. Historians began to see how often proximity fuses tipped engagements quietly and decisively. The men behind the technology received little public recognition. They were overshadowed by projects with clearer symbols and louder legacies. The Manhattan Project, radar development, names that became shorthand for victory. Tuve, the physicist who asked the question that changed everything, remained largely unknown outside scientific circles. Yet the proximity fuse arguably had greater immediate battlefield impact than nuclear weapons. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the Pacific War, but they were never used again. Proximity fuses were used everywhere, every theater, hundreds of battles, millions of rounds, day after day. They saved lives repeatedly, invisibly. The story of the proximity fuse carries lessons that extend beyond one war. Breakthroughs often come from asking the wrong question, at least by conventional standards. Everyone wanted better accuracy. Tuve asked whether accuracy mattered at all if shells could compensate for error. Impossible often means only that no one has yet accepted the cost of trying. Every expert said miniature radar inside an artillery shell could not be done. It was done anyway. Elegant solutions are not always the best ones. The proximity fuse was crude by electronic standards. It was noisy, inefficient, ungainly. It worked, and that was enough. Secrecy can be as decisive as innovation. The fuse remained effective, not only because it worked, but because the enemy never understood it in time to respond. The weapon and its secret were inseparable. And finally, the most important weapons are not always the most dramatic. Nuclear weapons dominate memory. Proximity fuses won battles. Both mattered, but in very different ways. Today, the proximity fuse survives mostly as a museum object. At the National Museum of American History, several examples sit behind glass. The display is easy to miss. A small metal cylinder, roughly the size of a coffee cup, resting quietly among larger and more visually dramatic artifacts. Tanks draw crowds. Aircraft command attention. Most visitors walk past the fuse without slowing. Those who stop see nothing extraordinary. A simple shell, a cutaway revealing crude-looking electronic components, wires, a tube, no elegance, no obvious brilliance, nothing that announces itself as a revolution in warfare. The placard is brief. Proximity fuse allowed artillery shells to detonate near targets without direct contact, dramatically improving anti-aircraft effectiveness during World War II. It does not explain the scale of the achievement. It does not show the thousands of hours spent in laboratories and test ranges, the hundreds of shattered prototypes, the moment when a vacuum tube finally survived gunfire, the manufacturing innovations that turned a laboratory curiosity into millions of identical, reliable devices. The secrecy that kept enemies blind while the sky filled with airbursts. It does not show German engineers holding fragments in their hands, knowing something extraordinary was happening, knowing Allied fire had become mysteriously lethal, yet unable to understand why. The answer present, examined, and dismissed. It does not show a British gunner loading shells and watching V-1s disintegrate in mid-air, seeing vengeance weapons tumble toward the ground, knowing that London was being saved without knowing how. It does not show Merle Tuve, when the first prototype survived firing, proof that the impossible had merely been difficult, or the moment when combat reports arrived, showing interception rates so high they seemed implausible. All of that history is reduced to a small metal object behind glass. The proximity fuse is a reminder that decisive technologies are not always obvious. Not the biggest guns, not the fastest aircraft, not even nuclear weapons. Sometimes victory comes from making a shell smart enough to know when to explode. Sometimes the greatest achievement is invisible, a radio signal leaving a shell, bouncing off an aircraft, returning, being recognized and acted upon in a fraction of a second by a device smaller than a soda can. A device flying hundreds of miles per hour, surviving forces that would destroy ordinary electronics, detonating at exactly the right moment. The Germans never understood it. They held the pieces. They examined the components. They knew something extraordinary was happening. They never saw the whole. That was not an accident. One physicist asked a question no one else had asked. What if shells could sense targets? The answer became 22 million rounds fired in every theater of the war. It became airbursts over oceans, forests, cities, and beaches. It became battles won without the enemy understanding why they were losing. The magic was never magic. It was physics, engineering, and the refusal to accept that impossible was the final word. That is how the proximity fuse shattered the V-1 offensive and reshaped modern warfare without ever demanding attention.